So, yeehaw! Welcome to Drinks Coach. Today, Vinesack, Drinks Coach UK, all lowercase. Ask me any questions you like. I am deep diving, or at least medium snorkel diving, American whiskey. Thank you very much to Benji Purslow, who very kindly had a nice chat about his brands and very kindly sent some bottles in, so I didn't have to pay as much money as I thought I would to do this show. Also, I was down at Sainsbury's today. £25 for a bottle of Jack. £22 for a litre. Hope it's still on offer. That's ludicrous. Okay, if my daughter was here, she would be pleased, but actually my wife will end up drinking this. So, right. We have Jack Daniels, also known as JD number 7. We have Rittenhouse 100. Bottled in bond. It's at 50% alcohol. We also have Elijah Craig Small Batch, much vaunted, utterly delicious bourbon, incredibly smooth, beautifully put together. Right, so a bit more about the story of these two. Yes, Benji Purslow, who sent these in, works for Heaven Hill as a brand ambassador, and they have a whole range of incredible heritage brands, as we call it. Old Fitzgerald, Pikesville Rye, which is beautiful, a Maryland style rye, where this is a Pennsylvanian rye. But they have a whole range of different brands. Evan Williams being their sort of like budget go-to bourbon, which is much underrated. Well, if you go to Heathrow, if you go to Gatwick, I have noticed that if you need a shot of bourbon before getting on a plane, I don't know how I found this out. They have Evan Williams there at the back bar, so you can get decent whiskey, even in airports in this country. So American whiskey, anyway. So we've got 3 different whiskies here, which kind of tell the story, the current story of America and American whiskey. It's a very complicated process. And everyone, I think, likes to think that whiskey started... Is it Scottish whiskey or is it Irish whiskey? Was it Scots people that went over there? Or was it Irish people that went over there? Well, you'll notice that in America, it's always spelt whiskey, I'll say almost always spelt whiskey, E-Y. Elijah Craig, Small Batch, Bourbon Whiskey. Can you see that? Whiskey. Yeah, I did notice on Rittenhouse, it actually doesn't have an E. Maybe that's a sign of where its origins come from. Because if you're drinking whiskey from Scotland, it has no E. If you're drinking American whiskey generally, Tennessee whiskey, it tends to have an E, which implies that it has something to do with the Irish immigrants coming over to America and making great drinks. Now, it's not all true. There's a lot of knowledge, and there was a lot of knowledge in distilling amongst not only the plantation owners and other people from other countries, because, you know, distilling happens all over the world, but also from the slaves. A lot of the slaves were actually involved as expert kind of help that would work for 2 or 3 different plantations, getting in their corn or their sugar cane or whatever, or their cereal crops, and making what was very good corn moonshine, for want of a better phrase. Heaven Hill has a brand which is loved by bartenders. It's wonderfully smooth, called Mellow Corn, which is actually a corn new make, a white whiskey, which is quite delicious. So I thought what I'd do is I'd pour these as I would normally if I was drinking them. I'm not going to use my posh Glencairn whiskey glasses or anything like that. So we have a couple of different tumblers which just grabbed off the shelf. There we go. Give it some air, let them breathe a little bit. In fact, for the Jack Daniels, I'm going to do it exactly how I would normally drink it, which is as a Boilermaker. This is getting a frosted glass out of the freezer, putting in some beer. Doesn't have to be very, very good beer. In this case, the greatest thing in the world that tastes of absolutely nothing. Pacifico Claro. Then I'm going to get my Boilermaker Jack Daniels. Cheers. Oh, yeah. That's how to drink Jack Daniels. Right. Take it a bit more seriously now. Jack Daniels. Why is it so popular? Well, like many of these things, phenomenal marketing. If you look at the best, most popular drinks and the most successful drinks in the world, it's almost never down to being the best or the best value. It's down to how well it's presented itself. Now, it does make a great story, Jack Daniels, of being from Lynchburg, which is actually a dry county You're not allowed to drink there, although the distillery's there. And it's just over the border in Tennessee. But what is involved in all of that is very, very clever manipulation of the truth. One of the things that Jack Daniels will say on the bottle is it says, Jack Daniels, Old Number 7 brand, Tennessee Sour Mash Whiskey. You don't see Sour Mash written on anything else. And it's made a kind of a virtue, a frown upside down, if you will, of a process called the Lincoln County filtration system, which is a way of making whiskey which, in all fairness, probably had some pretty prickly and spiky edges. It wasn't necessarily the finest cut from the still. And by putting it through charcoal made from sugar maple, and the two most famous examples of this would be Jack Daniels and George Dickel, which is the other great Tennessee whiskey, the other big producer. George Dickel actually steeps its whiskey in sugar maple charcoal, where Jack Daniels pushes it through a filtration process, which can take up to a whole week. And what happens is it takes out all the hard edges. So when they talk about Jack Daniels filtered through sugar maple charcoal for a smoother flavour, it is true, smoother than it would have been, but it takes out almost all the good stuff as well. It's not selective. It takes out both the harsh ethers and esters and aldehydes, but it also takes out quite a lot of the colour and a lot of the good stuff too. Jack Daniels, people who drink Jack Daniels, they're not making a statement that they're whiskey experts. I mean, my daughter at 18 went, oh, I've got half bottle of Jack Daniels for my birthday from a friend. And I said, oh, lovely. She's not a whiskey expert, but she identifies the brand the same way my wife did when she went to see Guns N' Roses in concert, supported by Faith No More. Oh, I wish I'd been there, right? So it's about identity. It's about buying an apple because you have an identification with Apple as a brand. Apple Mac, not Apple Fruit. So let's have a taste. It smells very phenolic. There's a real kind of acetonic smell, which just comes from, a fairly brutal distillate, really. It's not unpleasant. There's reasons why this is drunk. When you drink it, very smooth. It doesn't have the same breadth and richness and roundness. It doesn't have the oiliness that big, small batch, handmade craft whiskies have. But neither does Jameson. Jameson's my go-to whiskey. If I want just a session whiskey, I put Jameson in ginger beer or ginger ale. It's delicious. Or if I want a shot, I'll go get a shot of Jameson because it's well made and it's light. It's triple distilled, which is another way of making these things. Makes all the impurities go away. You know, there's a reason why this whiskey is popular. And the packaging's fantastic. The story's well said. Sour mash on the front. It goes, oh, it's sour mash. All whiskey's sour mash, just so you know. It's just they made a virtue of it. Benji actually mentioned to me, and I just immediately remembered it straight away, a scene in Mad Men, the great, brilliant drama about Madison Avenue and the ad men of the 50s through to the current day. And one of them said, well, how do we sell these cigarettes? And they were Lucky Strikes. And they said, just write toasted. Just write Lucky Strike. Toasted tobacco for fuller flavour. And they said, but everyone toasted tobacco. He said, yeah, but no one said it yet. And that's what sour mash really means. If you close down the distillery, maybe in times like now when they are overproducing and they have to shut for a while and furlough their staff, then when they make the mash again, it's a sweet mash. It's a normal mash. And as the mash starts to ferment, it turns into a sour mash. So it's a bit like the mother for a sourdough bread. The mash is very important to the process. But there we go. It's a whiskey. By all intents and purposes, it's a bourbon. But it's been through the Lincoln County filtration process, so it's bottled as Tennessee whiskey. It does actually have to come from Tennessee, but it's actually more of a production process than a geographical designation. Okay, so moving on. I wanted to do this first before this for various reasons, but this is one of my favourite whiskies. It's a bartender's favourite. I love straight rye. Obviously, rye, when we talk about rye, we're talking about the cereal crop. Rye whiskies have a certain unique flavour, which made badly is pretty horrible, in all honesty. You don't find very cheap, you don't see many, if any, cheap, decent rye whiskies on the market, because it takes class and style. And Heaven Hill has two phenomenal brands. I mean, if there's three rye whiskies that I go to, two of them are Heaven Hill's brands, which is this Pennsylvania style, which is Rittenhouse 100, bottled in bond, and Pikesville, which is the Maryland rye style. Maryland is where a lot of whiskey distilling started in America, probably because of the whole process of having slaves and everything else, but let's not dwell on that. The other one is Whistle Pig, which I think is a wonderful product. Anyway, so what's different about this? Well, first of all, it has to be made from 51% rye. Well, then, if that's made from rye, what's other stuff made from? Well, it tends to be a blend of different cereal crops. And bourbon, specifically, has to be made from a whole load of corn. That's right, sweet corn, maize. Then it will have possibly a tiny amount of wheat, but that's unusual. But the rest will be probably split between rye and barley, which is what malt whiskey is made from, malted barley. So they're not using malt barley as a base in America, which is where the fundamental sweetness, roundness, and difference in style, difference in aging process, and everything else stems from. Okay, and if you think about it, sweet corn comes from South America in all its forms and guises. It's a very sophisticated, very complex species of plant with very many different types of corn. And came with that was the experience and the knowledge of distilling. So people were distilling stuff, native Indians were distilling stuff a long time before any immigrants arrived on the great United States of America. So how do I describe rye? It always has a very dry entry. When I taste rye, it has a tight entry, sort of freshness. It tastes like whiskey, has a poise, but there's a lovely orange rind, slight nuttiness to it, but there's always a lovely orangey tang. It has a lifted twang to it. And sometimes when you taste vodkas that have a little bit of rye in them, it has this similar kind of bounce to it. It's not as soft and smooth and flat. It's got a real kind of lifted, perfumed, very satisfying tang. The other things, of course, this is bottled at 15% ABV, 100 proof. And it's still so wonderfully easy to drink. It has wonderful artifact, which is the sort of aftertaste is a lovely complex of wood, some new oak wood characters, probably some second fill notes, some slightly banana-y, more herby flavours, more spicy flavours. But it's whistle clean, and the finish is peerless. Just finishes with such class. There's no kind of nastiness behind it or anything. There you go, Rittenhouse, bartender's favourite and a stalwart to boot. You can use straight rye pretty much in any drink that you make with bourbon. There's a drink called a Boulevardier, which is made like a kind of like a Negroni, but with bourbon. If you take the bourbon or the whiskey out and you replace it with straight rye, I believe it's called a Sunny Jim, and that's an absolutely delicious drink. In fact, I don't use normal red vermouth. In fact, it works very well for me using Dubonnet with Rittenhouse. That makes a fantastic Sunny Jim. So here we are. We've got sort of everyday American whiskey. We've got a straight rye, but it isn't a straight rye. It's 51% rye, and then there'll be a mix of other stuff in there. And now we're going to come on to the champion. This is one of the great brands of bourbon whiskey called Elijah Craig. Elijah Craig small batch used to be called Elijah 12. But for various economical reasons, it was just not practical to make a whiskey which was 12 years or older at this price point. So now it's effectively whiskies down to the age of 8 years old, which is already quite old. I don't imagine that the Rittenhouse is any older than 6 years old, but it's a very satisfying, delicious, complete whiskey. But this is, I don't know, what can I say? One of a personal friend's favourites. Shout out to Mr. James out there. He's going to be jealous watching this. But most of the whiskey's still 12, 11, 10 years old. But it does have a little bit of younger whiskey in there just to make it more cost effective with the exchange rates and everything going on these days. It's bottled at 47% alcohol, which is not uncommon. Bourbons tend to be 46, 47. If you're going for a budget bourbon, because the tax breaks, they tend to be 40%. But they can't be less than that by law. So here we are with a proper bourbon. This has a mash bill. Mash bill is the recipe. So a mash bill on this whiskey will be something like 78% corn, and it will be 10% rye and 10% barley. Now, what's really interesting about the contents of different whiskies is they weren't decision makes. Somebody didn't decide, I'm going to make it like with a wine with 80% Cabernet Sauvignon and 10% Merlot. It's what they had. In certain states, they grow certain cereal crops, and you'll find that, for example, the exact mash bill on a Pennsylvania mash or a Maryland straight rye will be different, based really on what's grown in Maryland and what's grown in Pennsylvania, and that's really the story of it. The story isn't about people coming in and influencing how the whiskies were made, but the story is about whiskey being made with what you have locally. There was no railroad when whiskey started being produced. There was no road, certainly, so you had to have what you had locally. So there's a younger, but not very much younger, history behind American whiskey, which is disassociated with the whiskies of Europe, Ireland, Scotland, etc. So it deserves its own history and deserves its own special respect. This whiskey, it's palatable, it's potable, but I can see myself putting some cola in that later. This has this wonderful, tight, bright, stylish swagger. It stands up straight and it shoots a straight bullet. The Elijah Craig is so much more meditative. It's comes in, opens up like a cognac. Wonderful, lifted, beautiful, perfumed, fruity start. And then it comes into a taste which has all sorts of wonderful notes. A hint of banana, some dry dark chocolate. There's a kernely sort of waft, like a taste of almost almonds in there as well. It's just a very complex and very interesting drink. Look below for the prices. I'm afraid they're not £22 a litre. But I think pound for pound, these are very, very good examples of bourbon. You can buy delicious bourbon still for £50 or less. And I think this retells a story in 15 minutes as well as I possibly could. Go out and enjoy yourselves. I'm going to finish my Boilermaker. Cheers. Yeah.